Again, I'm speaking with Peter Singer, who's the director of the 21st Century Defense Initiative and a senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institution. He's also the author of Wired for War, The Robotics Revolution and Conflict in the 21st Century. And we're talking about testimony that he gave yesterday to the Government Oversight and Reform National Security Subcommittee, talking for the first time about the moral, legal, military, and political issues surrounding the use of drones as a weapon of war, and apparently in many ways the preferred weapon in terms of assassinating high-value targets, as they're called. There was an ethicist as well testifying. His name was Edward Barrett. And it seems that some of his testimony sort of reminds me a bit about the confusion over Citizens United versus the Federal Communications Commission, whether now corporations are persons in law under the First Amendment. There was a lot of talk about the personhood of these machines, right?
And that's what's, the remarkable thing here is that as controversial as the strikes into Pakistan are, in a historic perspective, we're talking about, the very first airstrikes in World War I compared to what may come later, which was, the bombing of Hiroshima with atomic bombs. I mean, this trend, this technology is moving at an exponential pace. And what he was raising is that as the technology gets better and better, as our autonomy of the system grows, and so the human role becomes ever more removed, both geographically but also chronologically, that is, the decisions that matter may be made by a human 7,000 miles away, or may be made by a designer years before the system goes into action, you get into a place where the laws just aren't ready. As I put it, the laws move at a glacial pace, whereas technology moves at an exponential pace. And so he was saying, and he's an ethicist, but he works actually at the U.S. Naval Academy. And he was saying, look, we may very well soon get to the point where we have to think about not just the legal accountability of the people behind the machines, but he was posing the question, do you have to think about the accountability of the machines themselves? And can you even do that? And, what's fascinating is that this is a dialogue that's being pushed by someone in military employ, not by the scientists who are building these machines.
Well, you can see the reason for these, to raise these ethical questions, because one of the things that I found particularly odious about the Iraq War, and to some extent, Peter Singer, you wrote about it in Corporate Warriors, the rise of a privatized military industry, was that the Bush administration were deliberately trying to make this war as painless as possible. And the press went along with a kind of censorship where we never saw dead Americans, we never saw dead Iraqis, except Al Jazeera showed it around the clock. So we're living in an alternative universe here. They didn't pay for it. They put it off the books. And, the impression was that they were trying, and by using as many mercenaries as they could get their hands on and give contracts to, they were also trying to cut down the casualty rate and make it as painless as possible. So we've already had an example, surely, of how leadership can look for ways to make war as invisible and painless as possible.
It's a great point, and I think there's three things that come out of that. One is the connection between the outsourcing trend, private military contractors, and the robotics field is actually tighter than a lot of people might realize, and that was one of the other things that we spoke about at the hearing. A great deal of the support force for robotics today is outsourced. For example, 75% of the maintenance and upkeep and weapons loading for U.S. military Predators is actually outsourced to private companies. You have other systems that are described as, quote, government-owned, contractor-operated. So you're entering a very weird space that's, it sounds science fiction on the robotics side, but it's also a little bit sci-fi on who's doing what. The second thing is the idea that I think there is a line that connects these two in the other way, and it's that idea of outsourcing political costs. That whether you're talking about private military contractors or you're talking about Predator drones, both of them allow you to take actions where you don't have to worry as much about the political consequences of sending soldiers into harm's way. I remember doing a discussion with a soldier, and he described how one of the great benefits of a robotic system is he doesn't have to worry about writing a condolence letter to someone's mother. That impact, though, it's great for him and his unit, but that action can be something that dissuades a politician from sending troops into harm's way. And then the final aspect is what you raised of that idea of alternate realities. And I think we really do see this come to the fore with these robotic systems. We describe them with adjectives like costless, efficient, effective. Whereas I remember going out and interviewing people in the Middle East, and, for example, the editor of the leading newspaper in Lebanon used different adjectives. He described them as cruel and cowardly. And so, we're living in two very different worlds. It doesn't mean we're cruel and cowardly, but that's the perception 7,000 miles away. And that takes all the more importance when you're talking about these insurgencies where, the perceptions do matter a great deal in whether you win or lose.
Peter Singer, some of the other testimony from Kenneth Anderson, American University law professor, sort of hinted at the possibility of those that authorize these use of drones, and particularly in targeted assassination, could end up in The Hague. We know that there have been efforts to go after Henry Kissinger and suits against Rumsfeld, I believe. There's a Spanish judge that was looking away to find some jurisdiction to arrest any of these senior members of the U.S. government if they were to travel abroad. What came out of that exchange?
I think he was trying to be a little bit provocative, because he ended it by saying that he thought that these strikes were legal, but that his underlying point was that if we don't come out and define what laws we believe authorize these strikes, and he was specifically speaking about the lawyers within CIA and within the White House, that if we don't define it, then in this vacuum we allow other people to determine whether they see it as legal or not. And that essentially he was arguing that the current lawyers, I believe his quote was something like, they're doing the president a disservice by not defining the action right now. There is some question, again, as to a civilian role, in actions of war, but, the question here is, it's clear the issues when you're talking about airstrikes in an active war zone, like in Afghanistan or Iraq, where, the military is responding to what they call a tick incident, troops in contact, troops that are being fired at. And so when you authorize that Predator strike, the legalities are much more easy to figure out. It's the other kind. It's the kinds that are being operated by civilians, where you have political appointees and intelligence officers making a decision about an airstrike into a non-active war zone. And in particular, what he was saying is that at least previously we've tried to authorize this by saying, well, this all links back to 9/11. It's all connected to Al-Qaeda. But at some point, you start going after groups that aren't linked to 9/11, that aren't Al-Qaeda. That's just the fact of the way politics evolves. And so he's saying you have to figure out what the legal means are that are defining this action. And if you don't have any, then you're opening up a big can of worms.
Some of the testimony, some of the questions from the Congress were about the notion that how would you defend Taiwan with aircraft carriers if all of a sudden 10,000 Chinese manufactured mass-produced drones were sent towards Taiwan. I think that gives an indication that one of these days the shoe may be on the other foot, that we may lose our advantage having invented these things. Others may mass produce them in greater number. But your testimony, Peter Singer, you mentioned that other people have used them. American vigilantes have used them on the border. Hezbollah used them during Israel's 2006 invasion. And most recently, a gang of thieves in Taiwan. So in the last minute or so, can you quickly run us through those scenarios?
Well, essentially what we're saying here, what the reality is this technology isn't a U.S.-only technology. 43 other nations have built, bought, and used military robotics, as well as a range of non-state actors that you listed, everything from terrorist groups to criminal gangs. And so the point is probably the best parallel for robotics today is where the automobile was in 1909, or where the computer was in 1980, or where the airplane was in 1918. That is, we're using it, but a lot of other people are going to be using it as well, and the types of roles they're going to be using it for are a wide variety in war, but also civilian life. And so that means we really need to wrestle with the implications of this new technology and understand where it's headed, and as well as start to catch up the laws to it, because otherwise, if the laws are absent, that's when they're abused the most.
Well, I thank you so much for joining us here today in Los Angeles, Peter Singer.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.